we wanted to kind of overturn some of the basic principles of role-playing games. So instead of everyone expected to cooperate in pursuit of objectives, everyone is kind of at each other's throats at all times. And so we were kind of purposely looking to subvert some of the tropes of tabletop role-playing games.
Hi, welcome to the Dieku podcast. I'm here with Greg Costikyan. Now, Greg is, it's an honor to have Greg here because he has made such classic games as Paranoia, my beloved box set of Paranoia, the Star Wars D6 role-playing game, as well as Toon. And let me get this right because I don't want to mess this up. Winner of 5 Origin Awards, the inductee into Adventure Gaming Hall of Fame, the Maverick Award from GDC for tireless promotion of indie games, the author of a number of science fiction and fantasy books, as well as essays and books of the game design theory. I have no words, I must design, and then certainty in games. Greg, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
You've been in the industry so long that you are in the, the primordial state of game design. I know one of my other ones that I've kind of researched is the stainless steel rat that came out in the Aries magazine. Just tell me, how did you get started in tabletop role-playing games and game design in general?
Well, when I was a teenager, there was a company in New York called SPI, which stands for Simulations Publications, Inc. And they had open playtests on Friday night where you could come and play the games under development there, which was a good deal for them because they essentially got free playtesting. And it was a good deal for those of us who were interested in their games because we got to feel like we were participating in their development in some sense. So basically, I hang around the SPI offices, playtesting games and making a nuisance of myself. And when I was 14, the workers in the warehouse went on strike. And Jim Dunnigan hired me and a bunch of other teenagers to be scabs and come in and do the work of assembling and shipping games. And at the time, we were not even being paid in money. We were being paid in company scrip that we could take to the front desk and exchange for games published by SPI. But at some point, I had all of the games that the company published and started selling the script to other playtesters at like 80 cents on the dollar. And at that point, Dunnigan decided, well, maybe we should put these people on minimum wage. So I continued doing that for a couple of years. And at 16, Dunnigan put me on the design staff as a kind of gopher, making copies of playtest maps and Xeroxing rules and that kind of thing.
And then, if I could just back up a second.
Go ahead.
When you were a kid, did you grow up playing games? Like, was that like just something that you were so passionate about that it just kind of led to you seeking out SPI?
I mean, to some degree, we always had some board games around and played them, but I was not, I think, a particularly enthusiastic gamer. But I subscribed to Strategy and Tactics magazine, which was what publication of SPI, which published the game in every issue. And I had a group of friends at my high school who were interested in these games as well. So I really got into it. So,
did you play like Dungeons and Dragons and that kind of fare as well?
Sure. I mean, I was a board war gamer before Dungeons and Dragons was published, but I purchased it in 1973 when it came out at the science fiction bookshop in Manhattan. So, and played a lot of it.
So. I guess I'm wondering, where's that kernel? Because you've become such a icon in the game design industry. I was curious if it just was just in something that you were born into, that you just naturally were inclined to I love games.
I mean, my mom was a radio producer and my dad was a lawyer. So there was this, it's not like there was a big family push towards games. And in fact, I remember in my 20s, my dad kind of suggesting to me that I had done this long enough and should go get a real job. But, that's I guess pretty normal.
And so you were the scab and then you started to being the gopher. And what was the next step for you in your career?
So they, they basically, SBI had a system where the designer of the game often had a second person called a developer who would do things like rewrite the rules, run play tests, work with the designer to refine the design. And they put me on a couple of projects, one with Rich Berg on Conquistador. And so I, started working on design, although not my own original designs. And then like a year later, they were doing they had a series of games called Quads, which were 4 games using the same base rule set with special rules for particular battles, and 4 battles set in kind of the same milieu. And they did a North Africa quad and assigned me the task of designing a game based on the Battle of Alamein, which was published under the name Supercharge, that being the British name for the operation of the Battle of Alamein. It was a terrible game, thankfully long out of print. But that was my first published game. And then I continued doing games for SBI, partially on staff and partially as a freelancer throughout the remainder of high school and college. And then in 1982, they were taken over by TSR, which basically shut down the office and shipped a few people to Lake Geneva to work for them, but most of the people at SBI were not particularly interested in living in East Dogfuck, Wisconsin.
And so when did you get that kind of big break where you went, okay, this is something I can do as a career, and you go, this is my lifelong path?
Well, so I graduated from college with a degree in geology and did not particularly want to go work for Exxon to explore for oil or something. And I contemplated going back to grad school and, becoming a career academic. But in the meantime, I just kept on designing games. So I don't know that there was any point in which I said, I'm going to do this. There were several years when I was essentially a starving artist, trying to make the rent by designing a whole bunch of games on a freelance basis. And then West End Games decided to expand its operations. And I did sell them a game as a freelancer, which was Bug-Eyed Monsters, and then went to work for them. And eventually became what I think now you would call chief creative officer, but at the time I was director of R&D, managing the design department, the editorial department, and the art department.
And did that kind of scratch your itch as far as your creativity, that artist in you that you said, oh, I have a vision for a game and I have the ability to kind of combine all the pieces and make it into something that I want?
Well, by that time, I already felt like I was kind of a seasoned professional because I'd worked on so many titles at SBI and as a freelancer. So yeah, I felt pretty confident in my ability to design interesting product.
And Paranoia, that was your first game there at West End?
No, the first game was
Bug-Eyed Monsters.
Bug-Eyed Monsters, and I think Web and Starship predated it as well. But yeah, so I had actually done a preliminary design of Paranoia before I went to work for West End Games. So the original idea for Paranoia was Dan Gelber's. Dan was a local area games master, and a lot of the prominent features of Paranoia are absolutely his, like the computer, alpha complex, secret societies, and so on. And I played it with him, and I said, I think this is a great idea. Would you mind if I went off and tried to turn it into a polished professional set of rules and sell it? So I did a first draft of the game, and I submitted it to a bunch of companies, including GDW, and it was rejected multiple times. And then when I was at SBI, at some point, Eric Goldberg, who I had known previously, I met him when we were 14, became vice president at West End Games, and said, that game Paranoia, let's take another look at it. And so they signed a contract for the game, and we started work on it. A lot of the character of the game, actually, I would ascribe to Ken Ralston, who worked on it as a freelancer for us. Ken later went on to a stellar career in computer games. Worked for Bethesda Softworks for many years and worked on both Oblivion and several other games for them, and is now retired. So, but we still get together on occasion.
Yeah, and Ken has obviously gone on to careers similar to yourself. I think he's become an icon in the industry as well.
I would call him much more prominent than me, actually, but that's fine.
And then, I mean, Paranoia too, in the world of indie games, or not indie games, but role-playing games at that time, everything seemed to be fantasy. You'd have the occasional maybe superhero game, but Paranoia really kind of took it in a different direction, which I really appreciated, probably at the time, that like it was unique. And I think it really hit with like an impact as far as what could be done with role-playing games.
That is part of what we had in mind. One of our basic ideas was that we wanted to kind of overturn some of the basic principles of role-playing games. So instead of everyone expected to cooperate in pursuit of objectives, everyone is kind of at each other's throats at all times. And so we were kind of purposely looking to subvert some of the tropes of tabletop role-playing games.
And I think then shortly after that success, Star Wars D6 came out. And can you maybe walk us through the process of like between getting the licensing and then the creative aspects of that?
Oh, sure. So Eric and I both flew out to California to negotiate with Lucasfilm over the rights to Star Wars. Neither of us had driver's licenses at the time, so we actually hired a limo to take us out to Lucas Ranch and wait for us to return.
Did they think that who are these guys showing up in a limo? Who do they think they are?
Well, but the other thing about this is Lucasfilm owned LucasArts, which was a publisher of computer games mostly, but not exclusively, graphic adventures. And Eric and I both knew several people at LucasArts, including Noah Falstein and Chip Morningstar. And I think they were willing to vouch for us as being, smart, creative people. So we made a bid for the rights. Daniel Scott Poulter, who is the owner of West End Games, was also owned a company that at the time was the exclusive importer of the Bruno Magli line of Italian women's shoes, handbags, and belts, and was a very rich man. So he was willing to front the money for the license. We later learned that TSR had also bid on the license and had offered more money, but they decided to go with us.
Wow.
So went back to New York and started work on the game. There were two basic principles that guided the design. One of them was that I wanted to kind of recreate the cinematic fast action and somewhat humorous feel of Star Wars. And the other was that I wanted to avoid the thing that RuneQuest does, where you top out at some point by having, like 95% skill and really no route for advancement there. I wanted the continual, potentially infinite advancement that a game like D&D offers, which is where the D6 system really comes from. The idea that you can just get more dice as time goes on.
And West End
and then the other side,
Ghostbusters, correct? West End had done Ghostbusters, so you kind of had that in-house.
Yes. Actually, Ghostbusters was designed by the Chaosium team, although we developed it further and published it. So, and then the other thing is I wanted to avoid having classes as D&D does, and instead having a kind of skill-based system the way RuneQuest does to allow people to have more diverse and more customizable characters. So, that's where that came from. Now, it's interesting to me that you said D6 because, and that is what West End turned that system into ultimately, because I have always kind of been an opponent of generic systems, because I feel that the design really should be tailored to the setting and the aesthetic of whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, which is what I was trying to do with Star Wars. So when they turned it into a generic system, I was kind of like, well, okay, I was long gone from West End Games by that time. So.
I know that I'm a fan of the D6 system, and not necessarily for its genericness, but because it does play well cinematically. And I know that even in Savage Worlds, I know that if you're familiar with that system, has also been inspired by the D6 concept. So it's got legs, and it still continues to this day. I think everybody kind of dusts it off every now and again and goes like, this is an interesting aspect of it. And I don't know if you've seen all the iterations on the D6 system, and primarily it's more iterations on your D6 system than the Ghostbusters system, although obviously they're in conjunction with each other. So I don't know if have you seen any of the iterations of it afterwards?
Not really.
No.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity now, do you pay attention to the tabletop world anymore, or is it more, have you moved into video games primarily?
I really don't pay much attention to role playing at this point. I do play a lot of board games. So
Okay. And so during the Star Wars and the licensing era, like, were you a Star Wars fan growing up? Probably, if you were a geek like most of us in this realm, that you probably
well, sure.
were a fan.
I was a serious science fiction reader. I mean, I subscribed to Analog and Asimov's and all those things for years. And sure, of course, I enjoyed Star Wars. I liked Star Wars. I also, for that matter, worked on a couple of Star Trek games for West End Games. So.
Well, and I think I would love to hear your kind of take on it, as far as everybody really credits like your game and all the source books that came out for keeping the franchise alive. And when, they were dusting off to do some novels, the Zahn novels, that they came to you or looked at your source books and said, hey, like, this is some good stuff.
Yeah, I remember having a conversation with Timothy Zahn at a science fiction convention, in which he told me that he was using the source book as material for his novels, and so yeah, it's credited in some circles anyway as being kind of the beginning of the extended universe. Obviously, we didn't anticipate that at all, but it's kind of interesting.
And when did your relationship with West End Games come to an end, and like, what was the next transition for you at that point?
So at that point, I went off and decided I wanted to write. So I started writing my first short stories and my first novel, and also did some freelance work. Lucasfilm actually came to Eric and me as they were producing Willow, and asked us to license the Willow game rights from them, which was interesting because instead of going back to the company, they came back to the people they thought of as being creatively interesting. So we made a kind of complicated three-way deal with Lucasfilm and Tor Books to do a Willow game. And we did that, and I actually think it's a pretty good game, but of course the movie did not do as well as anyone had anticipated, and the game sales were not that great. At that point, I basically became a house husband for about 6 years. My then wife was an investment banker and made a lot more money than I did. So if one of us was going to stay home with the kids, it made more sense for it to be me. And so during that period, if you're taking care of small kids, your productivity is not at the highest level. But I did manage to get some writing done. And also Eric had made a deal with Prodigy to do a computer game on the Prodigy service called Mad Maze. So I did a lot of work on that. I remember like slouching back in front of my computer with my infant child on my chest, snoozing away while working on the game. And that was published in 1989, and is the first online game to attract more than 1 million players. So, hey.
Was it just a natural evolution for you to go into the video aspect of it and take what you had learned in tabletop and port it over to video?
Sure. But the other thing to keep in mind, though, is my wife was an investment banker. That means she's tied to New York. That means I was tied to New York. And once West End moved to Pennsylvania, there was not a lot of game development, tabletop game development going on in New York. And obviously, there's just a lot more money in digital games than there is in tabletop. So yeah, it made sense for me to move in that direction.
And then with that said, you're moving to the video game industry, and you've been like a huge advocate for indie games and trying to disrupt the systems, I guess, the sales systems and the distribution systems. And I've seen your talks on GDC a number of times. And can you just talk about like how you envision what you would like to see in the video game world? And I know there's been lots of iterations of how games have been sold now, mobile and just internet based. But can you just talk about like the challenges that you've seen for indie designers for both tabletop and video?
So the thing to keep in mind is that in the pre-Steam era, games are almost exclusively sold at retail outlets. And a GameStop does not have that much shelf space. And what happened, and also over time, the cost of game development has skyrocketed, of AAA game development. And the reason for that is as computing technology improves, you kind of have to take advantage of the latest and the greatest if you're going to appear to be competitive with other product. So Greg Costikyan sometimes calls this Moore's Wall. As computing power increases, the cost of game development increases. And a consequence was that the competition for shelf space meant that fewer and fewer, and the increase in budgets meant that you had to, the number of unit sales you had to make in order to make a game commercially successful also soared over time. And that meant that whole genres that had once been successful in the field, like graphic adventures and even real-time strategy games, fell off the cliff. And in the 90s and early aughts, we were facing a situation of diminished creativity because companies are not going to take a risk on an original design if they are going to be spending $100 million on a game. And I felt that the whole field was becoming more and more stultified, and became an advocate for indie games. And I used to say we need to find a viable path to market for games developed by smaller teams and at lower budgets. And in fact, I founded a company to attempt to do that, which turned out to be a dismal failure.
Was that Game of Sutra?
No, it was called Manifesto Games.
Okay, sorry.
But Valve cracked that nut. So we're now at a situation where there is a viable path to market for indie games, and it's not that it's an easy market to crack. Most indie games do not, in fact, become commercially successful, but some do. I've been playing a lot of Spiritfarer recently, which is an indie game which has now sold more than 1 million units. So I'm actually quite pleased that the goalposts have been moved, and we do have an outlet for creative and innovative design in a way that we did not 20 years ago.
Do you think now we've actually run into the other problem that there's almost too much to choose from, that it's so accessible now to make a game that how do you actually get in the mind's eye for the audience?
Discoverability is a big problem, right? And it does mean that indie developers need to be savvy about building community and building a market, which is also why now there are publishers that specialize in indie games that can provide some of the support along marketing and sales lines that somebody sitting at home with a computer and designing the game of their dreams is not necessarily going to have those skills. So.
Your essay, I have no words and I must design. The title somewhat matches the content. The content is kind of describing the structure of games and what games are. But the title itself really struck me as like, it seems like more of a call for you, that you said, I have no words and I must design. Like, is it just a calling for you that you love designing?
Yeah, I do. The other thing to keep in mind is at the time I wrote that, which was late 80s, I guess, there was almost nothing in print or available that discussed game design as a form. And the title is basically, what I was saying is we don't really have the words to discuss what we do as designers. And here are some approaches to that. I launched a personal website very early after the internet was open to commercial use. And so in those days, if you if you went searching for something about game design, you encountered that article. So lots of people have read it. It's been republished in a bunch of places and is often used as one of the materials in game studies courses across the globe. So I have something of I have some prominence in the game studies community as well as in the games industry.
And then Uncertainty in Games, I think that was 2008, 18 maybe that came out.
16 or 17, I think. Yeah. So actually, that book is a result of a podcast interview with some people in New York. I think their podcast no longer exists, in which I talked about the subject. And one of the people who listened to the podcast was Jesper Juhl, who is a game studies academic and was editing a series of books for MIT Press. And he said, "Would you like to write a book on what you talked about in the podcast?" And I was like, "Sure." So it's out there. It's not like I've made a lot of money off of the book, but I'm surprised that it continues to sell, and I do get checks from MIT Press every year. So hey.
And now that in your most recent jobs, are you doing consulting? Are you back in that creative seat?
At the moment, I am lead designer on a massively multiplayer online game being developed by Playable Worlds. Playable Worlds was co-founded by Raf Koster, who's the designer of Ultima Online and Star Wars Galaxies, and by Eric Goldberg.
Oh, you're back together, the team.
Yeah, well, I have worked with Eric at 5 different companies over the course of our careers. SPI, West End Games, Crossover Technologies, Unplug Games, and now Playable Worlds. The product I'm working on has not been announced, and so I can't really discuss it. But I did, it is an MMO. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And maybe as you're talking about, working with Eric over all these years, how has the community been? Like, I know you speak at GDC once in a while or other conferences. And how have you seen the community change over the years from, like, when you look back upon, a 16-year-old working in the warehouse to now? Has it matured? Is it more professional, or is it still more of a, you get to meet people and it's acquaintances and friends that make those connections?
Acquaintances and friends are, extremely important in the field, and actually maybe more important for someone at my level of experience and age. So if you're 18, or if you're 21 and a recent graduate of a game studies program, you probably are going to get your job by sending a resume somewhere rather than by networking. But for a 60-year-old game designer is not something that is easy to find a job as, because the expectation is that the audience is younger, and therefore you want younger and more people more in tune with the zeitgeist. So I'm actually very, I feel privileged that I still can find work in the field. And yes, I mean, I know a lot of people in the industry, and I've met a lot of people. My first GDC was then called the Computer Games Developer Conference, and it was founded by Chris Crawford, was in the late 80s, and there were maybe 200 people there. And that's, in fact, where I met Will Wright. And these days, GDC is thousands of people. Obviously, the whole industry is much larger. And also, it has moved from being the interest of a geeky few to one of possibly the largest entertainment industry in the world. So.
Well, you've definitely taken an interesting path, and you've been on the cutting edge throughout this whole time. And as you reflect upon your career as a senior designer now, do you have things that you're especially proud of at different moments, whether it's a game or like an initiative or something that you go, you know what, like now that I'm reflecting, this is what I'm just very pleased that I put out there for the world?
Quite frankly, most of my digital games are mediocre. Making games is hard, and it's particularly hard when you're dealing with publishers and the refractory nature of the form. I have not actually published a title in, I don't know, 12 years. I've worked on a whole bunch of different games, all of which have either been canceled or failed on the market. The last game that I was really enthusiastic about was a game I was working on for Disney Playdom called Disney Dream Kingdom. And it was essentially a Facebook game in which you got to build your own Disney theme park. And I fell into this job and I was told this is what I was going to be working on. And I was like, oh my God, this is such an obvious surefire hit. This is going to be great. It turned out to be a problem. We worked on it for, so we were basically told by management that this is the crown jewels of Disney's IP and we have to do something really special. And we knew that the new version of Flash was going to support 3D, and Unity said at the time that they were going to be supporting export from Unity engine to Flash 3D. And so we said, okay, we're going to do it in 3D. It's going to look amazing. It's going to be something that like no one has ever seen in a Facebook game before. The export to Flash was not then working, but Unity had announced that it would be available within a couple of years. So we started working the game. 2 years and $8 million later, Unity said, oh, just kidding. So we had a code base that could not be supported over the long term. And we pitched upper management on pivoting to mobile, but they were basically, nah, we spent too much time and too much money on this. So that was a major disappointment. But shit happens. Probably 2/3 of digital game projects never see the light of day for one reason or another. So,
do you feel like when you're working in an environment like that where there's departments and teams and the creative and it's all kind of separated, do you kind of miss the days that you could do like the stainless steel rat game and just like go, I'm gonna write it, we'll throw some art into the mix, and you're just more at the grassroots level of just designing something?
There is a lot to be said for the ability to throw something together. And that's one of the reasons why I do kind of miss tabletop design. But I do like working in a team, at least most of the time. I mean, there certainly, I have been in toxic work environments at times in the past, but I feel like our current team is really good, really smart, really capable people. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. It does mean that as a designer, the task is a lot different, right? So you spend a lot of time writing specs. We have a wiki with the spec for our game on it that's, I don't know, 100,000 words, maybe. And then a lot of it is just monitoring what's going on, having one-on-ones with my staff, participating in scrums. And one of the things I try to do is keep eyes on everything. If I can't be in a meeting that's talking about a feature, I want at least somebody from the design team to be there so they can report back to me about what went on. And a lot of what I'm trying to do there is just raise red flags. It's like, no, that actually isn't the intent. No, that choice is going to limit what we can do in future, and we need to think about alternatives, that kind of thing. And then, of course, I spend a lot of time actually playing the game. And part of the reason for that is, although we have a QA team, what QA is really for is saying, this is to spec, this isn't to spec, here are the bugs I found. But when a designer tests, it's more along the lines of, actually, this kind of sucks. How do we fix that? Right? So you can't necessarily expect QA to uncover gameplay issues. They will uncover bugs, and they will uncover whether the thing performs the way it's supposed to perform. So design needs to be involved in that process as well.
For a young designer, and I mean, you've probably worked in enough companies now to kind of see the best path forward, and I'm sure there's many paths forward, but do you see pitfalls that you always see young designers kind of fall into, or do you have any recommendations for them?
Yeah. So one of the pitfalls, of course, is just to what you like, but the audience you're aiming for may not be you, and therefore you have to try to resist your impulses in some cases. I mean, the Disney game I was working on was aimed at a middle-aged female audience. And there is nothing more humbling than watching a test of your game by people who are not core gamers and realizing that no, they really don't get it, and we have to figure out how to make them understand what the game is about. So that's one. The other is that game development programs these days do a pretty good job at exposing people to design thinking by people like me and Raf and Jesse Schell and so on. And they also do a pretty good job of teaching them basic technical skills, so that like I have hired in the last, I guess, 18 months, two really junior people, one straight out of University of Utah's master's program, and the other out of UT Dallas as a bachelor's program. And they're more technically capable than I am. And that's great, because one of the things we need to do is script a lot of game systems, and they can get in there and do that in our scripting system. And I can do that as well, but I'm far less fast and efficient as they. So the other thing I would say, though, is if you are an aspiring game designer, I would advise you to eschew specific game pipeline to industry programs like DigiPen or Full Sail, and instead go to a more conventional university that does offer game development programs, and study both graphic development tools as well as programming in addition to your game studies things. Because one of the realities of the industry is that we work people really hard, and a typical game industry person burns out within about 5 years. So you want to have the technical skills to be able to make transition to another field if that winds up happening to you. Do you think whereas if you go to one of these game industry specific programs, it's like you're tracked. It's hard to break free.
Do you find, you talked about sub-toxic environments and that kind of thing, and I know there's like long hours and tight deadlines and that kind of thing. Do you feel that's, and the burnout, and do you feel that's sustainable, or do you think there's a better model out there?
There absolutely is a better model, and I think the industry is changing. I think that kind of overwork thing is less and less the case. It still happens, absolutely, but I think I think the industry has realized that it's not really sustainable, or frankly even worthwhile. You can say to people, we're going to be working for 60 hours, and for maybe 2 weeks that will improve your productivity, but then people are just going to get tired, and it's going to reduce your productivity. I have never been involved in a game project that didn't involve some level of crunch. And I believe that some level of crunch is acceptable if it's along the lines of, we have a major deliverable to our publisher in 3 weeks. We need to work really hard to wrap up the loose ends and deliver something that will shine. But that's a couple of weeks of crunch. It's not like unending crunch or months of crunch at a time. And so that's what we try to avoid. I think part of the reason that industry attitudes are changing, though, also is, I mean, I'm the oldest person at my company, but our average age is not in the 20s, right? So people have real lives, people have jobs, have kids, and therefore, if we want to retain talent, we also have to start treating them better. At my company, we have actually had one period of crunch as we were working towards a demo that we needed to use to show to potential investors, but in general, we are anti-crunch and try to ensure that people don't overwork. In fact, we will specifically tell people. Sometimes people do it because they're just enthusiastic, right? And they'll put in hours on the weekend or extra hours. But we actually try to tell people, no, take the weekend off. Take care of yourself.
And is your workspace now, like, especially with COVID, is it now all digital? Like, people are working remotely?
Well, okay. Let me talk about that a little bit. it. In 2009, when I shut down Manifesto Games, I decided I wanted to continue working in the industry. And New York is almost a desert as far as game development is concerned. So I have moved around the country a fair bit. I was in San Francisco for 3 years working for Disney Playdom. I worked for Boss Fight in McKinney, Texas for a year. I worked for Backflip Studios in Boulder for a year. And when Raph was founding the company, so Raph is himself an eminent game designer, and in fact, one of the people I look up to. I think he's a better game designer than I am. But he also wanted to be CEO of the company so he could control the process and the project more explicitly. And that means he spends a lot of his time on administrative tasks and dealing with the board and investors and this kind of thing. So he could not be hands-on in a design capacity. So when he was founding the company, he was looking for someone to fill that role. And I've known Raph for years, and one of the things was you had to be willing to move to San Diego in order to do the job. It's like, okay, fine, I've done this before, I'll do that. So in January of 2020, I moved to Escondido, North San Diego County, for the job, and found a place there. And I figured I was going to be there for at least a few years. And then in March of 2020, Raph said, well, we're going to be working from home now for the foreseeable future because of COVID. So my choice was to stay in my tiny little cottage in Escondido all by myself, or fly back to my apartment in New York, which I have kept all this time. It's rent stabilized, and I had a daughter in local schools, and it's in one of the best school districts in New York. So I flew back to New York to be with my wife and daughter. And so it's been remote since. And in some ways, I actually like this because I get to work 3 hours before everyone in California, and I have uninterrupted non-meeting time to get stuff done before the inevitable onslaught of video meetings. So yeah. And at this point, whether or not, we actually gave up the office in San Diego a little while ago, and we've talked about when we're going to reopen an office there, and I imagine it will happen. But I also don't know whether or not I'll be going back to San Diego at this point. It seems to be working pretty okay. Now, I would never have said that before. I would always have said, you want your designer sitting with the team. It's just kind of an essential role, and they need to be with the team. So maybe I will go back. I don't know. We'll see how it works out.
And what do you kind of see in your future as far as, are you going to just keep designing forever, or do you ever envision a retirement, so to speak?
My guess is that this is my last job. We won't be launching the game for a couple of years, and I will want to be involved in live ops as well. But at some point, I will probably say, time to go. But retirement for me probably means I go home, I write some books, I work on some board games, right? So and maybe even do a indie game of my own. So.
That would be very
short of senility. I don't really see any reason to stop.
Yeah, maybe you'll get back to tabletop role-playing games. It'd be interesting to see that as well, as that's kind of where my kind of heart and passion lies myself. But anyways, I think it's been really informative to have you as a guest on the show today. Really appreciate it. I just want to thank you from probably many game players over the years and aspiring game designers that have been influenced by some of your words and wisdom, and hope that they get a little bit more from you today. And I just really appreciate you joining me today.
My pleasure.